The sun was shining brightly over the luxury car dealership as the morning buzzed with excitement. The showroom was filled with gleaming cars, from sleek sports models to the most extravagant luxury vehicles. There were wealthy clients browsing, and salespeople dressed in sharp suits, eager to make a sale. Among the fancy cars, the atmosphere was filled with the sound of hushed conversations and soft footsteps. At the entrance, the glass doors slid open, and a frail, elderly woman walked in. Her clothes were simple, nothing like the designer suits of the other customers. She wore a modest dress, old shoes, and carried a worn-out purse. Despite her appearance, she walked with an air of quiet confidence. Her eyes scanned the cars, and she slowly made her way through the showroom, as if she had all the time in the world. The salespeople, who were busy with other customers, barely noticed her. That is, until a young man named Jake caught sight of her. He was a confident, well-dressed salesman who thought he knew how to read people. When he saw the woman, he quickly dismissed her as someone who would never be able to afford a car from their high-end dealership. "Hey, Bob," Jake called to his colleague, nodding toward the old woman. "Looks like we got a visitor who won't be buying anything today." Bob, another salesman, glanced over, smirking as he took in the woman's appearance. "I'd bet my commission she can't afford a car here. Look at those shoes." They both chuckled under their breath, their laughter barely audible but laced with judgment. They didn't think anyone could hear, but little did they know, the woman had heard it all. She continued walking, her steps slow but deliberate. Every now and then, she would stop to admire a car, running her fingers gently over the polished chrome. She seemed so out of place, yet there was something about her calm demeanor that made her stand out. The other customers barely noticed her as they ogled the cars, more interested in their own desires than in the elderly woman who quietly roamed the showroom. Jake couldn't stop himself from speaking again. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice laced with a fake politeness. "Can I help you with anything? Maybe you'd like to take a look at some used cars. They're a little more affordable." The woman turned her head to face him. Her expression was calm, almost serene, as she met his gaze. There was no sign of anger, no frustration. She simply nodded and said, "I'm looking for something special." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Special?" he repeated, unsure if she was joking or not. "We've got some great luxury models here. Perhaps you'd like to see something that suits you." She simply nodded again, giving a soft smile. There was something almost regal about her calmness. But Jake wasn't concerned. He knew she would never be able to afford the cars on the showroom floor. "All right," he said, turning to walk toward one of the display cars. "Let me show you our best model." As he walked away, he gave Bob another look, and they both exchanged quiet chuckles. They were both sure the woman was just wasting her time. What could she possibly know about high-end cars? But the woman didn't follow them. Instead, she slowly walked over to a nearby bench and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. She seemed to be content just to watch the busy hustle of the showroom, her face showing no emotion. The mocking laughter of the salesman was like background noise to her, and it didn't seem to affect her in the least. Minutes passed, but the salespeople kept their distance. As far as they were concerned, she was just an old woman who had wandered in to waste time. Jake continued to work with other customers, showing off the most expensive cars on the lot, while Bob stood by, keeping his eyes on the woman in the corner. But there was something different about her, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. Despite the obvious disrespect they had shown her, she remained poised and calm, never saying a word, never reacting to their comments. It was as though she wasn't even bothered by their laughter. The day wore on, and more customers came in, some serious buyers, others just window shopping. The woman remained seated, quietly observing. She never tried to speak with anyone else, never asked for help, and never made any indication that she planned to make a purchase. As the afternoon sun started to set, Jake and Bob continued their work, completely ignoring the woman in the corner. It was as though she had become part of the scenery, a forgotten figure in a world of wealth and luxury. Finally, when it was time to close the dealership for the day, the woman stood up. She walked slowly toward the exit, her steps measured and calm. As she reached the door, Jake, still busy with another customer, barely glanced up. Bob didn't even acknowledge her departure. But just before she left, the woman stopped at the door and turned around. With a soft voice that carried through the showroom, she said, "Thank you for your time. I'll be back tomorrow." Her words hung in the air. And then, just like that, she walked out of the dealership, disappearing into the evening. Jake didn't think much of it. He figured it was just a polite farewell. Bob simply shrugged it off, but something felt different. There was a strange feeling that lingered in the air, a sense of anticipation, but neither of the salesmen could put their finger on why. Little did they know, the old woman's visit was only the beginning of something they never saw coming. The next day at the dealership started like any other. The showroom gleamed under the bright lights, and the sound of footsteps echoed as staff moved from one task to the next. Salespeople were already busy with clients, and the air buzzed with the energy of potential sales. Jake, the young salesman from the previous day, was feeling confident. He had closed several deals that week and was in a good mood. The morning rush seemed like it would be another easy day for him. He couldn't help but think back to the old woman who had come in the day before. He had dismissed her so easily, so arrogantly. After all, who would come to a luxury dealership in such old clothes? She didn't even ask for help when he offered. It was as if she didn't care. He laughed to himself, shaking his head at the thought. "What a weird lady," Jake muttered, smoothing his tie as he prepared to greet the next customer. But then, the door to the dealership swung open. At first, no one paid much attention. People came and went all the time. But this time, something was different. A sleek black Rolls-Royce pulled up outside the dealership. The hum of the engine stopped, and a couple of staff members raised their heads, curious. The luxury car was unmistakable, its shining chrome accents gleaming under the sun. Jake squinted, narrowing his eyes. He had never seen a car quite like this before, and he couldn't help but wonder who had arrived. Then, the driver's side door opened, and out stepped a tall, imposing man in a perfectly tailored suit. He had an air of authority about him. And as he moved, it seemed like everyone in the showroom paused. He was not just any man. There was something special about him. Jake's eyes widened as he tried to place him. Before he could make sense of it, the man was joined by someone else. From the back seat of the Rolls-Royce, an older woman stepped out. Her hair was neatly styled, and she walked with the same slow, deliberate steps that Jake had seen the day before. She looked the same modest dress, the same worn shoes. It was the same woman. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What in the world?" Jake mumbled under his breath, his mind racing. He had thought she was just some old lady with no connection to anything important. But now, she was stepping out of a Rolls-Royce. And with this man, who looked like he could buy the entire dealership. The woman walked calmly toward the entrance, her eyes scanning the cars just like the day before. But this time, Jake couldn't dismiss her. There was something undeniable about her presence. It was as if she held an invisible power, something beyond his understanding. Jake quickly made his way toward the entrance, but as he approached, the man who had stepped out of the car moved toward him. His expression was serious but calm, and his posture was firm. "Excuse me, I'm here to speak with the manager," the man said in a deep voice that carried authority. Jake blinked, trying to keep his composure. "Of course. May I ask who's visiting us today?" he said, trying to remain professional despite the confusion swirling in his mind. The man gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm David Rivers," he said. "I'm the owner of the company, and this lady is my mother." Jake's mind went blank. "The owner? Your mother?" Jake stuttered. He looked at the woman who had walked in with him. "The woman from yesterday. She's your mother." David nodded slowly. "Yes, that's correct. She came by yesterday, and I'm here to ensure that everyone knows how important she is to me." His voice remained calm, but was laced with an undeniable power. Jake stood frozen for a moment, trying to process the information. The woman from yesterday, the one he had mocked with Bob, was not just any ordinary person. She was the mother of the CEO, the owner of the entire company. And here he was, standing in front of the man who controlled everything. His throat went dry as the realization hit him. Before Jake could respond, David motioned toward the showroom floor. "Please, lead me to the manager. I have some business to discuss." Jake was still stunned, his mind spinning. The salesman tried to recover, but everything felt like a blur now. He had no idea that the person he had so easily dismissed was this powerful, this important. He could feel the weight of his mistake beginning to sink in. Moments later, Jake watched as David walked calmly through the showroom, his mother following beside him. The salespeople, who had once been too busy to notice her, now seemed to take note of the new visitors. Whispers spread through the showroom like wildfire. The old lady from yesterday wasn't just some forgotten customer. She was the mother of the owner, the woman who held the power to shut down the entire dealership with a single word. And then the manager appeared. He came rushing over to David, offering a warm, nervous handshake. His face was pale as he greeted the CEO. "Mr. Rivers, it's an honor. We're so glad to have you here today." David gave a nod, but his eyes remained cold. "I'm here because of an incident that occurred yesterday," he said slowly, his voice firm. "I don't think it needs much explaining, but my mother deserves respect, not mockery." The manager's face paled even further, and Jake, still standing near the door, could only watch as the scene unfolded. His heart was pounding in his chest. Suddenly, the manager turned to him, his face full of tension. "Jake," he said, his voice tight, "get over here." Jake's legs moved on their own, walking toward the manager, who shot him a hard look. The manager turned back to David and spoke quickly. "We're very sorry for the behavior of our staff. Mr. Rivers, I assure you, this will be dealt with immediately." David's expression didn't change. "I'm not here for apologies," he said coolly. "I'm here to make sure my mother never experiences such disrespect again." The room fell silent. The atmosphere had shifted. What had started as a regular day at the dealership was now anything but normal. Jake's stomach churned. He had no idea what was about to happen next, but he had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The tension in the showroom was palpable as David Rivers, the CEO, stood quietly, his presence commanding the entire room. His mother, the seemingly unassuming woman from yesterday, stood next to him, her expression calm but her posture radiating authority. The staff, who had once ignored her, now watched in awe as the powerful figure of her son slowly began to reshape the atmosphere in the dealership. Jake stood frozen in place, his mind racing. He could hardly believe what was happening. He had dismissed this woman, mocked her, even, and now, here she was, standing beside a man whose influence could shatter careers with a single word. His hands felt clammy as the weight of his mistake pressed down on him. He could already feel the eyes of his coworkers on him, their gazes heavy with judgment. This wasn't just any customer. This was the mother of the CEO, the one who held the power to change everything. David turned toward Jake, his eyes narrowing just slightly. There was no anger in his gaze, but there was something far more powerful, calm, calculated authority. "Jake, is it?" David's voice was smooth, almost disarming, but the undertone was unmistakable. "You were the one who dismissed my mother yesterday." Jake's throat tightened as he nodded. "Ah, yes, sir," he stammered, feeling like a child caught in the act of misbehavior. "I didn't realize. I didn't know." David cut him off with a single gesture, a slow wave of his hand. "You didn't know, and I can understand that. But the fact remains, you treated her like she didn't belong here, like she was invisible." His words were measured, controlled, but they held an undeniable edge. "What you fail to realize is that everyone deserves respect, regardless of what they look like, how they dress, or what they drive. Jake swallowed hard, his face reddening with shame. He had thought that the woman was nothing but a random customer, a poor, old lady with no means to make a purchase at the dealership. How wrong he had been. As David spoke, the manager of the dealership approached, looking almost frantic as he wiped his hands on his pants. His face was pale, his expression a mix of anxiety and fear. He had heard enough from David to know that this was no longer a small matter. The CEO was not one to take things lightly, especially when it came to family. "Mr. Rivers, please, we can fix this," the manager pleaded, his voice shaky. "We'll make sure something like this never happens again. We'll retrain the staff. Make it right." David's gaze never wavered. "Retraining won't fix this. This is about something far more important: respect. The way people are treated in this place speaks volumes about your business. I won't stand for anyone being made to feel small or insignificant, especially my mother." The manager nodded quickly, his face reddening. "I understand, sir. We'll do whatever it takes." David turned to the woman beside him, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Her face was a study in calm, but her eyes were sharp. She looked around the dealership, her gaze sweeping over the polished cars, the eager salespeople, and the nervous staff. "You see," David continued, his tone softening as he addressed the room, "respect is not just something you give to the people who have the power to pay for your services. It's something you give to everyone who walks through that door. Whether they're in a luxury car or walking in on foot, everyone deserves the same treatment." Jake felt a knot in his stomach. He had failed to see this simple truth. His assumptions had led him to judge the woman based on appearances, and now it seemed he would be paying the price for it. But what he didn't know was just how much this one mistake was going to cost him. David turned back to the manager and then to Jake. "I want a full investigation into what happened yesterday," he said firmly. "I want to know who else was involved in this incident. And I want to be sure that the people who work here understand that there are consequences for their actions." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He felt his face flush with embarrassment. His mind raced, knowing that the consequences for his actions were likely to be severe. How could he have been so careless? How could he have mocked someone so important? The manager quickly nodded, his voice quick and apologetic. "Of course, Mr. Rivers. We'll get on this immediately." David's gaze never left the staff as he continued. "I'm sure some of you thought it was just a joke. That making fun of an old lady who didn't look the part was harmless. But this is a lesson in why assumptions can be so damaging." He paused, letting the words sink in. "In this dealership, and in this world, you'll never truly know who someone is by what they wear or how they look. My mother may not have come here in a fancy car, but she's been far more successful in her life than most of you will ever dream of being." The silence in the room was deafening. Jake stood there, feeling small and insignificant as David's words sank in. He couldn't deny it. He had made a huge mistake. And now, all he could do was wait for the fallout. David turned to his mother, who nodded once, her eyes still calm. "Let's go," he said softly. As the CEO and his mother walked toward the exit, the staff remained frozen in place, their eyes still wide with shock. The Rolls-Royce that had brought them there was waiting, gleaming in the sunlight, as if it had been part of an entirely different world. The old woman from yesterday, the one they had all dismissed, was leaving now, but not without leaving behind a powerful lesson that no one in the dealership would ever forget. Jake stood in place, his head bowed. He had never felt so humiliated. He had thought he knew the world, but now, in this moment, he realized just how much he had underestimated it. The next morning, the dealership was filled with an uneasy buzz. The staff had gathered for their usual morning briefing, but the room felt different. Tension hung in the air like a thick fog, and every whisper seemed to carry a weight far heavier than usual. Everyone knew something significant had happened the day before, but no one dared speak of it until they were sure of the consequences. Jake sat quietly in the back of the room, his thoughts a whirlwind. He had expected to be reprimanded right away, But instead, there had been silence. David Rivers had promised an investigation, and that promise was far more terrifying than any immediate punishment. The weight was unbearable. Jake didn't know if the worst had passed, or if the hammer was just hanging over his head, ready to drop at any moment. The manager, Mr. Clark, stood in front of the staff, a man who was usually so full of energy, but today his voice was somber, almost apologetic. "I know things have been tough here lately," he began, his eyes sweeping over the group. "But yesterday we learned a very hard lesson about respect. We lost sight of what really matters, treating all customers with dignity. And I don't think I need to remind you who taught us that lesson." There was no need to name David Rivers or his mother. Everyone knew exactly who had walked through the door the day before and who had the power to change everything. The dealership had already been informed that David Rivers had requested a full report on the incident, and not just for Jake, but for the entire staff. Now, Mr. Clark continued, clearing his throat. "There are changes coming. Some of you may be leaving us if you can't meet the standards we're setting. But there's also an opportunity for us all to learn and grow from this." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, his gaze landing on Jake for a brief moment before moving on. "What we do today and in the coming weeks will determine whether we keep our jobs or whether we lose everything." The weight of those words sunk in deep. Jake's stomach twisted with dread. He had been too proud the day before, too quick to make judgments, and now he was realizing the consequences of his actions. It wasn't just his job on the line. It was his reputation, his entire future. If David Rivers had his way, there was no telling how far the consequences would reach. Just as the briefing was about to end, the dealership's front doors opened with a soft chime, signaling the arrival of another customer. The room went quiet as everyone's attention shifted toward the entrance. The familiar sight of a sleek black Rolls-Royce gleamed in the parking lot, its elegant form catching the sunlight. The doors opened, and from it emerged David Rivers and his mother, the sane woman who had been mocked the day before. She moved gracefully, as if the weight of the previous day's events had never touched her. But it was not her presence that drew all eyes. It was the sleek, imposing figure walking beside her. The man who had been David's shadow the entire time. A man dressed in an immaculate suit, one that practically oozed authority. The way he held himself, the air of quiet confidence around him, made everyone freeze in place. His presence alone sent a wave of unease through the room. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He knew who this man was. David's companion was none other than the man who had been working behind the scenes to ensure the company's future. A high-ranking government official, a person whose connections could topple empires, a man who, if he were to speak against the dealership, could destroy everything. Jake couldn't remember the last time he had felt so exposed. David walked into the showroom, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The rest of the staff followed, their faces pale with anxiety. The entire atmosphere shifted as they entered the building. It was as if the dealership itself had become a different place, more intimidating, more powerful. David approached Mr. Clark with his mother beside him, his eyes never leaving the manager. "I trust you've taken care of the matter I asked about," he asked, his voice low, but not lacking in authority. Mr. Clark nodded quickly. "Yes, Mr. Rivers. We've started the investigation, and we're going over everything." His words faltered under the CEO's gaze. David held up a hand, silencing him. "I'll be reviewing the results myself. But right now, I'm here for a different reason." The silence in the room grew thick. What could this man possibly want now? Every employee in the showroom, including Jake, stood frozen in place, waiting for the next words to come from David Rivers' mouth. "Yesterday, this dealership failed," David continued, his tone calm but firm. "Not just because of the way my mother was treated, but because this place forgot what truly matters. And what truly matters is respect. Respect for the people who walk through that door, no matter their background or appearance." The room was quiet, all eyes on David as he spoke. Jake's mind was racing, his thoughts tangled in guilt and confusion. What did this mean for him? What would happen to his career? David looked around, his gaze sharp as it passed over the staff. I don't need to explain to anyone here the consequences of losing respect. But I'll say this. If anyone here ever forgets what happened yesterday, if anyone here ever treats another person like my mother was treated, I won't hesitate to take action. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The weight of David's words was like a heavy hand pressing down on him, a constant reminder of the mistake he had made. David paused, his eyes now resting on Jake. You can choose to learn from this, Jake, he said, his voice softer now. Or you can walk out that door and never return. The choice is yours. It was as if time slowed down for Jake in that moment. He thought back to the arrogance he had shown, the dismissive attitude he had adopted. He remembered the way he had laughed it off when he thought the woman didn't matter. But now, standing in front of David Rivers and facing the reality of the situation, Jake understood that this was no longer just about his job. It was about his character, about whether he could rise above his ignorance and become a better person. And so, with a deep breath, Jake made his choice. The room fell into a heavy silence as David Rivers' words lingered in the air. Jake's heart was racing, his thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. The weight of the choice David had given him seemed almost impossible to bear, yet there was something oddly freeing about it. The power to change, to make things right, was now in his hands. David's eyes never left Jake's face as he stood there, still and silent. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Jake's response. For the first time since his arrival, Jake felt completely exposed. But this time, it wasn't the anger or pride that had blinded him before. Now, it was something different, a quiet, undeniable understanding of the importance of respect. David Rivers stood calmly, watching him with an air of quiet confidence. There was no anger in his gaze, only the calm authority of someone who had long learned the value of choosing one's battles wisely. Jake took a deep breath. He could feel the eyes of every employee in the room upon him. The last few seconds had stretched out to feel like hours. He thought back to the previous day, to the mockery, to the dismissiveness that had been directed at Mrs. Rivers. He thought about his own role in that, his part in the insult, and he knew, deep down, that he couldn't keep pretending that it didn't matter. Not anymore. I'm sorry, Jake said, his voice quiet but steady. He wasn't sure who he was apologizing to, David, his colleagues, or himself. But the words felt necessary, almost cathartic. I should have known better. David didn't react immediately. He simply nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting those words, as if he had known all along that Jake would come to this realization. The air seemed to shift, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had paused. You've made the right choice, Jake, David said, his voice calm. But the real challenge begins now. It's easy to apologize, but it's much harder to change the way we think and act. The next step will be about showing through your actions that you understand the value of respect. Jake swallowed hard, but there was a spark of resolve in his chest now. He had no idea what the future held, but he was willing to fight for his place in it. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could learn from it. And maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference by setting the right example for others. David turned to his mother, who had been standing by quietly, watching the scene unfold. She gave him a proud, approving look, as if to silently acknowledge the way he had handled the situation. With a final glance at Jake, David walked toward the door, his mother by his side. But before they left, David stopped and turned to address the staff once more. Let this be a lesson, David said, his voice carrying across the room. Not just for Jake, but for all of you. Respect is not a privilege, it's a right. Never forget that. And with that, David Rivers and his mother walked out of the dealership, leaving behind a room full of employees who now fully understood the lesson they had been taught. Jake stood there for a moment longer, processing the gravity of what had just happened. For the first time, he realized that respect wasn't just about politeness. It was about seeing people for who they truly were, not based on appearances or assumptions. It was about acknowledging the worth of every individual, no matter their background. As the rest of the staff began to go back to their tasks, Jake felt a quiet sense of purpose. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But he was ready to start making changes, small steps toward earning back what he had lost. His integrity, his sense of responsibility, and above all, his respect for others. In the days that followed, the dealership began to change. There was a new sense of unity among the staff, a quiet determination to do better. And Jake, despite the difficult path ahead, felt hopeful. He had learned a lesson he would never forget, one that had been taught by the most unexpected of teachers, a mother who had been disrespected, and a son who had shown him the true meaning of strength. And perhaps in the end, that was the most important lesson of all.